The poor little boy brought milk to the dying Apache. Next week, 400 riders came for him. Dawn crawled over the prairie like a wounded animal, slow and trembling, its light catching on the frost that clung to the grass. 7-year-old Silas Briggs stepped into that pale hush, a tin cup of warm milk gripped between both hands, as if he feared the wind might steal it. The cup was too full, his arms too small, yet he kept walking toward the mesquite trees. The old soul in this tale remembers how the boy's breath trembled in the cold, how each step looked like a decision made by someone far older than he was, and how he paused at the first rustle in the brush, wondering if he should run. But he took another step, not knowing the world would remember this one. What he found lay slumped against a fallen log, a woman, Apache, by her clothing and the dark braids tangled across her chest, her skin patched with dust and blood. She looked no older than late 20s, yet the weight on her shoulders seemed carved from centuries. Her chest rose in shallow, uneven jerks. A deep gash ran along her ribs. Silas did not move at first. He simply stared, the way children do when facing something that doesn't fit inside the neat rules adults give them. Then she turned her head, just slightly, and fear flickered in her dull gaze, as if she expected a blow. And Silas, for reasons he couldn't name, felt something in him tilt toward her instead of away. He knelt awkwardly, the tin cup sloshing. "Ma'am," he whispered, though she looked barely conscious. She blinked, her breath rasping. Her lips cracked so badly they seemed carved. Silas lifted the cup, his hand shaking. She tried to turn her face, pride tightening her jaw even as pain forced her still. He whispered, "Please," a child's gentleness cracking through her defenses like light through a shutter. She allowed the cup to touch her mouth. The first swallow must have burned. She winced and nearly pushed it away. But she drank again, slowly, a trembling surrender. And in that surrender, a tiny thread tied itself between them, as fragile as a single strand of her dark hair. When she finished, Silas wiped her chin with his sleeve. She watched the gesture with a strange mix of gratitude and shame, not the shame of weakness, but of being tended to by someone who should not have had to learn tenderness so early. Her voice, when it finally slipped out, was faint. "Why help?" she murmured. Silas shrugged, the way children shrug when they have no words for what the heart decides before the head catches up. He asked her name, but she hesitated, eyes narrowing with old wariness. And after a long breath she whispered, "Nita," as if giving him something precious and dangerous all at once. He wanted to ask who had hurt her, why she was alone, why her breath rattled like winter leaves. But distant gunshots cracked the air, men hunting or pretending to. Silas flinched. Nita reached for his wrist and whispered, "Go." Not unkindly, but urgently, as though he were a spark she couldn't risk letting die. He ran, the taste of fear and milk and something new, responsibility, mixing in his throat. And though he didn't look back, he felt her eyes on him long after the trees swallowed him. The Brigg farmhouse sat crooked on a patch of stubborn earth, its wood split gray by wind and time. Silas slipped inside to the familiar scrape of his father's knife against the whetstone. Rowan Brigg was not a cruel man by frontier standards, only a tired one, hardened by debt and drought and disappointments he never named. May Brigg worked quietly near the stove, shoulders hunched as though bracing for a blow, even when none came. Silas stepped carefully, the way he always did when the house felt brittle. Rowan asked where he'd been. Silas mumbled, "Up by the trees." Rowan's eyes narrowed, suspicion flaring like a match, and the knife kept sliding across stone, each stroke a warning. None of them spoke aloud. May touched Silas's face gently after Rowan left the room, her thumb brushing a smear of dust on his cheek. "You're shaking," she whispered. "Tell me what you saw." Silas opened his mouth, but the words tangled inside him. Something, fear for Nita, or fear of what his father might do, held him silent. May searched his eyes. She saw something there, something heavy, but she didn't press. Instead, she pulled him into a brief embrace, the kind that tries to give what life has taken. And Silas wondered if mothers sometimes knew truths their children couldn't yet speak. When he returned to the grove near dusk, Nita was awake but still weak, leaning against the log with a protective hand over her ribs. He shared a small piece of bread, which she accepted with quiet dignity. She asked if he was punished for leaving. Silas shook his head. Then she spoke haltingly of her brother Tawakoni, of the hunger gnawing at their camp, of a rancher named Pike who had blamed her people for cattle gone missing long before they ever went near his land. Her voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion, as though she had run out of room inside herself to store resentment. And Silas listened, as if the wind itself had paused to hear her story. She touched a stone pendant at her throat, murmuring a prayer in her language. Silas didn't know the words, only that they sounded like someone speaking to the earth rather than the sky. He asked who she prayed for. Nita's eyes softened. "My people," she said. "And now you." Silas didn't know what to do with that. He kicked at the dirt, shy and flattered without understanding why. And he felt, for the first time in his small life, that someone saw him beyond his family shadows. Over the next 2 days, he brought scraps of food, water, and once a small blanket he stole from the shed. Nita gained enough strength to stand, though only with help. Sometimes she touched his hair, weaving a tiny braid at his temple, a gesture that made Silas glow with shy pride. Sometimes he told her little things, how his mother hummed when nervous, how his father's temper was worse when he drank, how he wished people wouldn't talk about Indians the way they did. She listened with the stillness of someone who had survived storms far worse than any child's confession. And each time he left her side, he felt the world heavier than before. On the third day, while Silas brought water, he heard hooves crunching through dry leaves. He ducked behind a cedar trunk as Marshal Cullen Hart dismounted nearby, scanning the ground. The marshal was a man carved from equal parts law and sorrow, his face lined by choices he'd never stopped reconsidering. He studied the tracks, 2 sets of footprints, one small, one light and dragging. His hand hovered near the butt of his revolver. Silas's heart lurched. If Hart found Nita, she would be taken, jailed, or worse. And Silas would have to live knowing he hadn't protected the only person who seemed to need him. And with the marshal stepping toward the fallen log, Silas felt fear wrap around his throat. Nita tried to crawl away when she heard the marshal approach, her breath hitching in pain. Silas burst out of hiding, shouting, "Please don't hurt her." The words tore from him like a branch snapping. Marshal Hart spun, startled, then froze at the sight, a farm boy shielding an injured Apache woman. For a moment, no one moved. The wind stilled, the grass held its breath, and the world shrank to the space between them. Hart studied Silas, then Nita, then the small bundle of care, water, bread, blanket, that told a story stronger than any accusation. And something in Hart's stern gaze softened, as though remembering a boy he once had been. He crouched slowly, keeping his voice low. "Son, hiding her is trouble." Silas nodded, eyes burning but unyielding. "I know." Hart exhaled, long and weary, as if balancing law against conscience. He touched the brim of his hat. "Her people will come for her," he murmured. Silas didn't understand the warning, not really. Hart stood, holstered his gun, and stepped back. "Get her well before someone else finds her," he said. Then he mounted his horse and rode off without looking back. And Silas realized he had been given a chance, fragile as a spark in dry grass. As dusk spilled across the prairie, Nita leaned into the log, breathing slowly, gratefully, studying the boy beside her. Silas told her the marshal had spared her. She nodded, closing her eyes briefly, the shadow of pain crossing her face like a passing cloud. He asked her quietly, "Will your people really come?" Nita opened her eyes, gaze drifting toward the distant ridges where the sky bruised purple. "If I live," she whispered. "If they know." And Silas felt something shift inside the wind, as if the land itself was listening for footsteps not yet arrived. The morning felt different, like the whole valley had paused its breathing, waiting for something it could not yet name. Silas stood beside the stacked firewood, his small hands trembling even though he tried to hide it, the way children hide storms inside their ribs. His eyes kept drifting toward the ridge where he had sat alone the night before, wondering how a 7-year-old boy had wandered into a moment big enough to change the course of his life. But today something else stirred in the air, a quiet warning wrapped in the wind's fingers, making him feel as if the world was about to shift under his feet. And he couldn't look away. It began with a sound, low, steady, weighty, like the earth was being claimed by approaching thunder. Silas raised his head. Dust was rising far beyond the cottonwoods, and a shiver ran up his spine as he tried to understand what he was seeing. At first it looked like a moving wall, then like a storm cloud touching the ground. Then horses, rows upon rows of them, 10, 20, 50. Then more, so many that Silas felt his breath falter as curiosity clawed inside his chest. And, at their head, riding straight and tall, was Nita, alive, breathing, standing like a warrior carved out of sunrise, and Silas couldn't blink. She moved closer, and the sun spilled around her shoulders like molten gold, turning her into something half memory, half miracle. She was still a little weak, but the fire in her eyes erased every doubt of her strength. Silas felt the moment hit him, sharp, warm, unreal, because just 3 days ago he had felt her slipping away in his arms. And now she returned with a nation behind her, a nation that might not forgive kindness so easily. The question rose in him like smoke. Why had she come? The riders drew near until the entire world felt made of hoofbeats. 400 of them, maybe more. Faces carved from stone, eyes carrying stories older than language, each gaze fixed on the tiny boy who had dared to save someone not meant to be saved. When they encircled the homestead, silence fell so deep the valley seemed to kneel under its weight, and Silas swallowed hard. Nita dismounted slowly, her steps calm but certain, like someone walking into the next chapter of her life without fear. She stopped in front of Silas, searching his face as though she needed to be sure he was real. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but powerful enough to steady the air around them. "You gave me life, Silas." The morning seemed to lean closer, listening to her every syllable. Silas stared up at her breath, her presence, her impossible survival, and something inside him trembled with wonder and worry, because gratitude from a warrior nation could just as easily become judgment, and Silas didn't know which one waited in her eyes. Nita took his hand gently, both palms closing around his small fingers in a gesture that felt like truth. "My people came to understand something. The one who saves a life cannot be an enemy." A pause followed, heavy as a held breath. "But there is still a debt owed." Silas felt the words hit him like cold water. He didn't pull his hand back, but fear crept quietly inside his bones. Was he to be punished? Taken? Judged for stepping across a line he didn't even know existed? Nita drew a breath that carried more weight than the morning breeze. "When you gave me water that night, some saw it as weakness. They said a white child could never be a friend. But when I returned alive, everything changed." Her eyes shimmered, holding back a trembling truth. "You touched me without fear. You gave me water. You pulled me from death. Because of that, my tribe sees you now, not as an enemy, but as a protector." Before Silas could speak, a tall man stepped forward from the riders, a chief with eyes like storms held back by will alone. He placed a heavy hand on Silas's shoulder, not harsh, but marked with the weight of respect. "From this day," he said in a low, solemn voice, "you are safe among us." The words settled into the ground like roots. Then he opened a wrapped cloth from his saddle and revealed a ceremonial blade, small, sharp, beautifully carved. He held it out to Silas. "This does not go to an enemy. Whoever holds it stands in our circle, not outside it." Silas accepted it, though his gaze stayed locked with Nita's, searching her eyes for the truth that seemed to tremble just under the surface. And then the story deepened. For while the riders began to shift back toward the valley, Nita remained still, her expression firm with a decision that seemed to break open the sky above her. "Silas." She stepped closer. "I am not going back." The wind paused. "My people accepted that I lived, but they cannot accept what changed in my heart. I was ready for death, but you showed me why I should stay alive. And now," she exhaled a soft, aching breath, "now I choose my own path." Then she smiled, a small, fragile smile that felt like dawn touching a cold world. If you want, I will stay here." Silas could only stare, a child standing in a moment far bigger than childhood. This woman, this warrior, wanted to remain by the little boy who saved her. But before he could speak, the horizon cracked with a new sound. A distant roar, hooves, shouts, a second wave of riders, coming fast. Nita spun around, her face tightening with instant fear. "They're not ours." Silas's grip on the ceremonial blade tightened, and for the first time, he felt something warm and fierce rising in him. "Who are they?" Nita's voice dropped to a whisper. "The ones who wanted me dead." The roar grew louder, swallowing the quiet morning. Nita stepped in front of Silas, her body a shield made of determination rather than armor. "If I stay here, Silas, we must fight or we must run." And Silas, without a flicker of doubt, said the words that surprised even him. "I won't leave you." Just before the first gunshot cracked through the valley, their fingers brushed, one feather-light touch, one soft vow, one beginning disguised as fear. And that single touch carried them both into the storm that came roaring over the plains. As bullets split the morning open, as dust swallowed the sun, as destiny charged toward them on pounding hooves, their story began writing its real ending.